Irene stood in the middle of the grand foyer, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the sleeves of her expensive silk blouse. The house was immaculate, polished marble floors reflecting the crystal chandeliers hanging overhead. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers and expensive perfume. It was a house that screamed wealth and power, every corner carefully curated to reflect the success of the family that lived within it. But in that moment, Irene felt small, like a mere speck in this world of opulence. She was the maid, the invisible presence, expected to be seen only when necessary and to remain silent when not. She moved quietly, her footsteps barely making a sound as she passed through the large hallways, the expensive artworks and designer furniture hardly acknowledging her existence. She was used to this feeling, the feeling of being just a shadow in someone else's home. But today was different. Today, something inside her stirred. She had been working for the McAllister family for over 3 years, tending to their every need, cleaning their expensive furnishings, and taking care of their children. They paid her well, but that didn't make her feel valued. She had long stopped expecting respect or acknowledgement from them. It was just part of the job. But today, as she entered the living room to straighten up the toys scattered across the floor, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Little Emma, the youngest McAllister child, was playing with one of the cleaning supplies. Irene froze in her tracks as she watched the little girl lift the bottle of cleaning spray to her lips, clearly unaware of the danger. The strong chemicals in the cleaner could easily harm her, but the child didn't know any better. Irene rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She took the bottle from Emma's hand gently, but the moment she did, the front door opened with a sudden crash. Mrs. McAllister, elegant as ever in her designer heels and perfectly styled hair, walked in. Her eyes immediately locked onto Irene and Emma, and the calm expression on her face shifted to one of fury. "What do you think you are doing?" Mrs. McAllister's voice was icy, every word laced with disdain. Irene, taken aback by the sharp tone, stepped back. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said quickly. You, just what?" Mrs. McAllister cut her off, her voice growing louder. "You think you can touch my child? How dare you? What kind of maid are you?" Irene felt the sting of the words like a slap to the face. She had never been treated like this before, not even when she was just starting out in this job. But she didn't back down. "I was just trying to keep her safe," Irene said, her voice calm, though she could feel the tension rising in her chest. Mrs. McAllister stepped closer, her heels clicking on the marble floor as she approached. "You think you know better than me how to take care of my child? Get out of here," she spat. Irene stood frozen for a moment, her hands still gripping the cleaning spray bottle. The silence in the room was deafening, and she could feel the weight of Mrs. McAllister's gaze on her. But then, a voice broke the silence. "Stop!" Mr. McAllister's voice rang out from the doorway. He was standing there, a look of shock on his face. Irene turned to see him, his expression not one of anger, but of confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone softer than his wife's, but still filled with authority. "Mrs." McAllister opened her mouth to speak, but he held up a hand, silencing her. "Irene, what happened?" he asked, his eyes now fixed on the maid. Irene hesitated for a moment, then explained the situation, how Emma had picked up the cleaning supplies, and she had simply taken it away to keep her from getting hurt. Mr. McAllister's eyes softened, and he turned to his wife. "She was only trying to protect our daughter," he said firmly. Mrs. McAllister stared at him in disbelief, but she said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable. Irene couldn't believe what she was hearing. For the first time, she felt like someone had actually listened to her. She had expected to be reprimanded, to be fired, or at the very least, publicly humiliated. But instead, Mr. McAllister had stepped in, defending her actions. She felt a strange sense of relief wash over her, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel conflicted. Would this be enough to change things? Would her position in this household ever be the same? Only time would tell. Irene stood there, frozen, her heart racing in her chest. The weight of Mr. McAllister's words hung in the air, the tension between him and his wife crackling like electricity. She had expected a reprimand, perhaps even to be fired for touching the child. But instead, here was this moment an unexpected twist. a glimpse of something she had never experienced in her 3 years of service for the McAllister family: fairness. For the first time since she had stepped foot in this house, someone had actually listened to her. But it wasn't enough to erase the years of mistreatment and silent suffering. Irene glanced at Mrs. McAllister, whose face was a mask of disbelief and simmering anger. She had always been the one to impose her will, to make the rules, and to enforce them with an iron fist. Her eyes, cold and judgmental, shot daggers at Irene. She wasn't accustomed to being challenged. Irene stood her ground, her chest swelling with a quiet pride. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when she would no longer be invisible, no longer just a maid who could be ignored and belittled. "I think we should have a discussion about this," Mr. McAllister said, his voice firm but calm. His words were directed at his wife, but he kept his eyes on Irene, giving her a silent assurance that, for the moment, her actions had not been in vain. Mrs. McAllister opened her mouth to protest, but Mr. McAllister raised a hand to stop her. "Not now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Let's just talk later." He turned to Irene, his expression softening. "Irene, thank you for protecting Emma. I know you were only trying to help." Irene nodded silently, feeling the strange mix of relief and uncertainty flood through her. She had never had this kind of interaction with the family before. Normally, she was spoken to as if she were nothing more than an object to be used and discarded. "You're welcome, sir," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign to her, but they were the truth. For once, she wasn't just a nameless, faceless servant. In that brief moment, she had a voice. Mr. McAllister gave her a small, approving nod, and then turned his attention back to his wife. "Irene, you may go back to your duties. I'll speak with Laura about this later." Irene didn't need to be told twice. She quickly turned and left the room, her thoughts swirling. As she walked down the hallway, her mind raced. Could this moment change anything? Would Mrs. McAllister actually listen to her husband for once? Irene didn't have much hope, but she couldn't deny the faint glimmer of hope that had sparked inside her. It was something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of possibility. As she continued down the hallway, the weight of her work seemed to lift slightly. The house, once cold and intimidating, now felt a little less oppressive, but that feeling was fleeting. As soon as she entered the small, cramped staff room, she was reminded of her place. This was not her home. She was not one of them. She was still the maid, the outsider. The door to the staff room opened, and Irene turned to see her colleague, Sarah, entering with a cup of coffee in hand. Sarah's eyes scanned the room quickly before settling on Irene. "What happened?" she asked, her voice low, as if she were afraid someone might overhear. Irene shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You won't believe it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. McAllister stood up for me." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "What? Really?" "Yes," Irene said, nodding. "He told Laura to back off, that I was just trying to protect Emma." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. That's incredible." Irene laughed softly, though there was no real joy in it. "I don't know how long it will last, but for now, I'll take it." The two women stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their words settling over them. It was a small victory, one that felt long overdue, but it was still a victory. "I hope this changes something for you," Sarah said finally, her voice filled with sincerity. Irene glanced up at her, meeting her eyes. "So do I," she whispered. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time, she felt like she had a chance to make it different. Irene walked down the long corridor, her footsteps echoing off the marble floors. She had just left the staff room, still processing the strange events that had unfolded earlier. She had expected to be reprimanded, possibly even fired, but instead, Mr. McAllister had stepped in and defended her. It felt surreal, like a moment she had never thought she would experience. Her mind kept returning to the way Mrs. McAllister had looked at her, the sharp contempt in her eyes. But Irene had held her ground, and for once, someone had listened. The thought brought a strange sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine, dusting, cleaning, organizing. The house, with its grandiose chandeliers and expensive furniture, felt colder than usual. It was as if the walls themselves were indifferent to her presence. Irene's work was done by the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the polished floors. As she moved to gather her belongings, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Mr. McAllister walking toward her, his face unreadable. He stopped a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored suit. "Irene," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I wanted to apologize for how things went earlier. Laura, she can be difficult sometimes." Irene nodded, not sure how to respond. "It's all right, sir," she said quietly, unsure of what to say next. She had never expected this conversation to happen, never expected him to acknowledge what had occurred, but his next words caught her off guard. "No, it's not," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "What happened today? It wasn't right. You shouldn't have been treated like that. And I should have said something sooner." Irene felt a lump form in her throat. It was the first time anyone in the house had acknowledged her as more than just an invisible servant. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "Mr. McAllister hesitated, then continued. "Irene, you've been with us for a long time, and I know you've been through a lot, but you deserve better than this. You deserve respect." The words hit her like a wave. She had never thought anyone in the McAllister household saw her as anything other than the help, the person who cleaned up after them, who kept their world spotless. "I don't want you to think you have to endure this kind of treatment," he said, his voice steady. "If you ever feel uncomfortable, if you ever need to speak up, you can. I'll listen." For a moment, Irene stood in stunned silence. She had never expected this kind of conversation from someone like him. Mr. McAllister was the powerful businessman, the one who ran the show, while she was just the maid, the one who cleaned, who served. And yet, here he was, offering her a level of understanding and respect she had never experienced before. "I appreciate that, sir," she said quietly, her voice shaking just a little. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this moment wasn't just a fleeting act of kindness. But years of mistreatment had taught her to expect nothing more than indifference from those around her. She didn't know if things would change, but at least for this brief moment, she could allow herself to hope. Mr. McAllister's gaze softened, and he gave a small nod. "I'll make sure Laura understands that her behavior was unacceptable," he said, "and I'll have a word with the rest of the staff. No one should feel like they don't matter." Irene didn't know how to respond. She had never heard words like that in this house before. "Thank you, sir," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. He gave her one last look before turning to leave. As Irene watched him walk away, she felt something shift inside her, a small, quiet sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. She quickly gathered her things and left the house, the evening air cool against her skin. As she walked to her car, her thoughts lingered on the conversation with Mr. McAllister. For the first time, she felt like her voice had been heard, even if just for a moment. Maybe that would be enough to change things. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she could see a small glimmer of possibility. Irene woke up the next morning with the soft morning light filtering through the curtains. She had barely slept, her mind still racing from everything that had happened the day before. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, something she had never thought would happen in her life. She had spent so many years as an invisible presence in the McAllister household, always doing her job quietly, always staying out of the way. But yesterday, for the first time, she had been heard. Mr. McAllister had stood up for her, and it had left a mark on her that she couldn't ignore. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, the thoughts swirling in her head. Could things really change? Could she be treated with respect here? Or was this just a fluke, a momentary lapse in the way the family viewed her? She shook her head, trying to shake off the uncertainty. It had to mean something. It had to. But even as she tried to convince herself of that, doubt lingered. She couldn't forget the way Mrs. McAllister had looked at her, the way she had dismissed her so easily, as if she were nothing more than a servant. Nothing more than a tool to be used when needed and discarded when not. The thought made Irene's stomach churn. But this morning, as she prepared for her day, She forced herself to focus on the good. Mr. McAllister had acknowledged her. He had seen her, heard her, and that was a step forward. As she entered the kitchen to start her day's work, Irene was surprised to see Mr. McAllister standing near the counter, sipping a cup of coffee. He looked up as she entered, his expression serious but not unkind. "Irene," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I wanted to apologize again for yesterday. I've spoken to Laura. I've made it clear that her behavior was unacceptable." Irene stood still for a moment, taken aback. She had expected to go through her workday as usual, without any further mention of the incident. But here he was, addressing it head-on. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly, unsure of what else to say. "It wasn't right how you were treated," he continued, his gaze steady. "You've been with us for a long time, and I know you've always done your best. You deserve better." Irene felt a lump form in her throat. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Not here, not in this house. She had always been just the help, the invisible woman behind the scenes, doing the dirty work. She had never imagined that someone, especially Mr. McAllister, would care enough to say something so simple, so human. "Thank you, sir," she repeated, her voice shaking just slightly. Mr. McAllister gave a small nod, as if to reassure her. "I'm not sure what will happen from here, but I want you to know that things will be different from now on," he said, his voice carrying a weight of sincerity. Irene didn't know what to make of his words. She had spent years being invisible, doing her work without ever expecting anything in return. She had learned to accept that her role in the household was small, insignificant. But now, here was Mr. McAllister, offering her something she had never dared to hope for: respect. It was a strange feeling, one that she didn't know how to embrace fully. Was this a genuine change? Or was it just a moment of politeness that would fade with time? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she couldn't ignore the fact that something had shifted. She couldn't ignore the fact that someone had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time in years. As she continued her work in the kitchen, Irene's thoughts lingered on Mr. McAllister's words. She didn't know if this would change everything, but for the first time, she felt like she had a chance. She had always done her best, always worked hard, never expecting anything more than a paycheck. But now, the world seemed a little different. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. As the day wore on, Irene went about her duties with a new sense of purpose. She had always taken pride in her work, but today, there was something else, something deeper, something that made her stand a little taller as she moved through the house. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was a person, a woman who deserved respect. And maybe, just maybe, she would get it. Irene had expected the day to pass as it always did, quiet, unnoticed, and filled with the mundane tasks of cleaning and organizing. But there was something different in the air today. Her movements felt more deliberate, her mind clearer. The heavy weight of invisibility that had burdened her for so long seemed to have lifted, even if only slightly. Mr. McAllister's words from yesterday echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe they meant something. She had been given a rare gift: acknowledgment, not just from anyone, but from the man who ran this house. She walked into the living room to tidy up the mess left by the children. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting soft rays over the furniture. Irene couldn't help but notice how peaceful the house looked in the morning light. The tension that had always lingered in the air seemed to have faded, replaced by something lighter. But as she was wiping down a side table, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps. She turned to find Mrs. McAllister entering the room. Her posture was rigid, her expression carefully controlled, but there was a coldness in her eyes that made Irene's heart race. Irene's breath caught in her chest, and she stood up straighter, mentally preparing herself for whatever was about to happen. She had learned to be cautious around Mrs. McAllister, to anticipate the sharp words, the dismissive glances. But today, it was different. "Irene," Mrs. McAllister said, her voice cold but not without a hint of something more. Irene looked up, meeting her gaze. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension. Mrs. McAllister studied her for a moment, as if trying to gauge something in Irene's demeanor. "I just wanted to say that I don't appreciate you speaking up in front of my husband yesterday." Irene's heart skipped a beat. But she didn't let it show. She knew this moment could either break her or give her more strength. "I was just trying to keep Emma safe, ma'am," Irene replied, her voice firm. Mrs. McAllister's eyes narrowed. "I don't care about your intentions. You should have known your place. This is my house, and I decide what happens in it." The words stung, but Irene refused to flinch. She had spent far too many years being silenced by people like Mrs. McAllister to let that happen now. "With all due respect, ma'am, I do know my place," Irene said, her voice low but resolute. "But I also know right from wrong. I won't apologize for trying to protect your daughter." The room was silent for a long moment, and Irene could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her. Mrs. McAllister stood frozen, her lips pressed into a thin line. Irene's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground, refusing to back down. Finally, Mrs. McAllister spoke, her voice still cold, but with an edge of something softer beneath it. "I don't like to be challenged," she said, almost as if to herself. Irene didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. The moment stretched on, the silence thick and heavy, until Mrs. McAllister turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. Irene let out the breath she had been holding, her body relaxing only slightly. She had stood her ground. It wasn't much, but it was something. She didn't know if this would change anything. She didn't know if Mrs. McAllister would ever respect her. But for the first time in a long time, Irene felt like she was no longer invisible. As the day wore on, Irene continued her work with a new sense of purpose. She moved through the house with more confidence, more determination. The sting of Mrs. McAllister's words still lingered, but it didn't hurt as much as it once would have. She knew now that she had a voice, that she didn't have to accept being treated as less than human. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but she had taken the first step, and that was enough for today. Irene spent the next few days trying to put the confrontation with Mrs. McAllister out of her mind. The moment had left her shaken, but also more resolute than ever. She had stood her ground, and despite the cold words from her employer, she felt a small flicker of something more inside her. She wasn't invisible anymore, but as much as she tried to focus on the positive, doubts kept creeping in. She had no idea what Mrs. McAllister truly thought, or if she would hold on to the bitterness of that moment. Irene was trying to get used to this new dynamic, trying to find her place in a house that had always felt like a prison. The routine continued. She cleaned the rooms, prepared the meals, and attended to the children. But now, there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. She no longer kept her head down. When she moved through the halls, she walked with purpose, her back straight, her steps more confident. The house didn't feel as heavy as it used to, and for the first time in years, Irene found herself standing a little taller. But the real test came one afternoon when she found herself in the kitchen, preparing lunch for the family. Mrs. McAllister entered, a slight frown on her face as she walked toward the counter where Irene was chopping vegetables. Irene tensed at her presence but refused to let it show. She kept her focus on her task, cutting the vegetables with careful precision. After a long pause, Mrs. McAllister spoke, her voice softer than usual. "Irene," she said, catching Irene's attention, "I've been thinking about what happened the other day, and I've decided to let it go." Irene's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know how to respond. This was unexpected. She turned slowly to face Mrs. McAllister, searching her face for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was a guarded, neutral expression. "I think we both got a little too emotional, Mrs. McAllister continued. And maybe I was too harsh." Irene swallowed, trying to process what was happening. Mrs. McAllister, who had always been so cold and domineering, was admitting fault. It was hard to believe, but Irene had learned that sometimes the hardest thing was accepting that things could change. "Thank you," Irene said, her voice calm, though the shock of the moment lingered in her chest. She wasn't sure if she believed it, but she also didn't want to dismiss this fragile olive branch. Mrs. McAllister nodded, her eyes scanning the kitchen, her posture still as stiff as ever. "Just remember your place here," she added, her tone cool but not as harsh as before. "You're not family, Irene, but I expect you to do your job well." Irene nodded silently, feeling the weight of the words. She knew her place, but for the first time, she wasn't sure if that was enough. She had always known where she stood in this house, but now, it felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. She wasn't sure what this new dynamic meant, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down just yet. Mrs. McAllister left the kitchen without another word, and Irene returned to her work, her mind racing. It was a small concession, but it felt like a victory. Irene had fought for respect, and in this moment, she had gotten it at least for now. She continued to move through the rest of the day with the same quiet determination, but a part of her remained wary. She couldn't forget how quickly things had turned before, and as much as Mrs. McAllister's words had been an acknowledgment of her worth, Irene knew it was only the beginning. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let herself fade into the background again. Irene spent the next few days cautiously navigating the household, still processing the strange interaction with Mrs. McAllister. Her employer's admission of being too harsh lingered in her mind. But Irene couldn't fully shake the memory of the biting coldness in Mrs. McAllister's voice. It felt like a truce, but she knew it was fragile. She moved through the house with care, her steps lighter but her guard still up. She wasn't sure if this would be the new normal, or if it was just a temporary change. But she couldn't ignore the slight shift in the air. Mrs. McAllister had, at least for now, backed off, and that was something Irene wasn't about to take for granted. But as the days passed, it became clear that Mrs. McAllister's apology, while unexpected, hadn't changed everything. The tension still simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but present. Irene noticed the subtle way her employer watched her now, the way she scrutinized her actions, but there were no more direct confrontations. Irene, however, remained on edge. She knew that things could change in an instant. It wasn't until that Friday afternoon that everything finally came to a head. Irene was in the living room, picking up toys left scattered by the children, when she heard the familiar sound of high heels clicking down the hallway. Mrs. McAllister appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Irene," she said, her tone neither warm nor cold, but somewhere in between. Irene turned slowly to face her, a small knot tightening in her stomach. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nervousness creeping up on her. Mrs. McAllister took a step forward, pausing a few feet away. Irene couldn't help but notice the tension in her stance. "I need to speak with you, Mrs. McAllister said, her voice lowering as if she didn't want anyone else to overhear. Irene's pulse quickened. She had hoped that the tension had dissipated, but it seemed that today would be different. "Of course," Irene replied, setting the toys aside and wiping her hands on her apron. She followed Mrs. McAllister down the hallway, her mind racing. They entered the study, and Mrs. McAllister gestured for Irene to sit. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened recently," Mrs. McAllister began, her eyes scanning Irene's face as though searching for a reaction. "I know I overreacted, but I want to make it clear that things need to return to normal around here. You're here to do your job, and that's what you need to focus on." Irene sat quietly, her heart pounding in her chest. The words were blunt, but they weren't unexpected. "I understand, ma'am," Irene said softly, trying to mask the unease in her voice. "Good," Mrs. McAllister replied, her gaze narrowing slightly. "I don't want there to be any more misunderstandings. You're here to clean, to take care of the house, not to get involved in family matters. Do you understand?" Irene nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The room was quiet for a long moment. Irene could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her, the air thick with the unspoken tension that still lingered between them. Finally, Mrs. McAllister spoke again. "I don't want any more problems between us. But you need to remember your place. There's no room for anything else." Irene's stomach sank, but she didn't say anything. She had learned long ago to keep her head down and stay out of the way, and now more than ever, it felt like that was the safest choice. Mrs. McAllister's words hung in the air like a warning, and Irene could feel the fragile truce between them beginning to crack. "Of course," Irene said again, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. McAllister studied her for a moment longer before giving a small nod. "Good," she said, turning to walk toward the door. "Remember your place, Irene. That's all I'm asking." Irene stood up slowly, her mind swirling. The conversation had left her with more questions than answers. She had hoped that the small victory she'd gained would lead to something better, but it seemed that the status quo was all that Mrs. McAllister wanted. As she returned to her duties, Irene couldn't help but wonder if she would ever truly be treated as an equal in this house, or if she would always be confined to the role of the servant, no matter how hard she tried to change the dynamics. As she cleaned the countertops and organized the cluttered kitchen, Irene knew one thing for sure: she couldn't let her guard down. Not yet. Not until she knew for certain that the fragile truce she had with Mrs. McAllister wouldn't shatter like glass at the slightest provocation. Irene woke up to the soft sounds of birds chirping outside her window, but there was no comfort in the sound. She felt the weight of the past few days pressing on her chest, the tension she had been trying to ignore now impossible to shake. Mrs. McAllister's words still echoed in her mind. "Remember your place, Irene. That's all I'm asking." The words stung, but they also sharpened her resolve. She had stood up for herself once, and now she wasn't going to back down. But what did that mean? What did it mean to stand up for herself in this house, where every corner was defined by the invisible boundaries of power and class? The house was quieter today. The usual hum of activity was subdued, as if everyone knew the fragile balance that had been struck. Irene had never been more aware of how thin that balance was, and it made every interaction, every movement feel like a delicate dance. She moved through the house, her steps deliberate, her eyes always scanning, always alert. But despite the quiet, something was different. The house no longer felt quite as suffocating. Mrs. McAllister hadn't spoken to her directly since their last conversation, and Irene had kept to her duties as she always had. But there was an undercurrent of tension between them, something unspoken, like a thread just waiting to snap. Later that afternoon, Irene was cleaning the guest bedroom when she heard the familiar sound of high heels clicking on the hardwood floors. She turned around, expecting to see Mrs. McAllister, but instead, it was Mr. McAllister. His presence was unexpected, and Irene felt a slight flutter of nerves in her stomach. She stood up straighter, wiping her hands on the cloth in her apron, unsure of what this encounter might bring. "Irene," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I wanted to speak with you for a moment." Irene nodded, setting the cleaning supplies aside. She was still uncertain of what had prompted this, but she followed him into the living room, the air thick with anticipation. Mr. McAllister gestured for her to sit, and she did, her hands folding nervously in her lap. "I've been thinking about what happened a few days ago," he began, his tone more measured now, "and I wanted to apologize. I know that things have been difficult for you in this house." Irene's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this, not from him. She had always known him to be distant, authoritative, but never sympathetic. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the surprise. Mr. McAllister gave a small nod, his eyes focused on her. "I know this isn't easy," he continued. "You've been with us for a long time, and I've seen the way you've worked. I've seen how much you've given, and I've realized that I've taken that for granted." Irene felt a flicker of something inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. It was as if he had finally acknowledged her humanity. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. McAllister paused, then leaned forward slightly. "I don't want you to think that I've forgotten your worth. It's just that things have always been this way in this house, and I didn't realize how much that affected you until recently." Irene's mind raced, her emotions a tangled mess. This was more than she had ever expected. For years, she had done her job quietly, without complaint. But hearing these words from him, hearing him actually acknowledge the way she had been treated, felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "You deserve respect, Irene," he said softly, "and I'm sorry for the way things have been." The words were simple, but they carried so much more weight than anything he had ever said to her before. Irene didn't know how to respond. She had never imagined a conversation like this would happen. She had always assumed that the hierarchy of this household was set in stone, that she would always be the maid, the invisible worker in the background. But this was different. This was him seeing her, really seeing her. "I don't expect anything to change overnight," Mr. McAllister continued, his voice steady. "But I want you to know that I will do better. I will do what I can to make sure you're treated with the respect you deserve." Irene's heart raced. and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something resembling hope. She wasn't sure what this meant for her future in the house, but this conversation, this acknowledgement was a start. "Thank you, sir," she said again, this time her voice filled with a quiet gratitude. Mr. McAllister stood up, and Irene followed suit. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that took her by surprise. "You're a valued member of this household, Irene. Don't forget that." And with that, he turned and left the room, leaving Irene standing there, her mind spinning with the weight of the moment. She had been seen, and for the first time, it felt like she had a place in this house, not just as a servant, but as a person. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. For now, Irene woke up the next morning to the sound of the house slowly coming to life. She could hear the faint sound of the coffee machine in the kitchen, the children's laughter echoing in the hallway, and the soft hum of the early morning bustle. But as she moved through the house, the weight of the last few days still lingered in her mind. Despite the small gestures of acknowledgement from Mr. McAllister, something inside Irene was changing. She had always been the one who stayed in the background, never drawing attention to herself, never asking for more. But after her conversation with Mr. McAllister, something had shifted. The house no longer felt like a place she was merely tolerated. It felt like a place where she might finally be seen as more than just the help. As Irene walked through the hallway to start her work, she noticed Mrs. McAllister standing near the front door, her back turned as she looked out the window. It was the first time in a long while that Irene had seen her in this way alone, without the usual poise and control. She hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but something inside her pushed her forward. "Ma'am?" Irene called softly, trying to gauge Mrs. McAllister's mood. Mrs. McAllister turned sharply, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Irene wasn't sure what to say next. "I just wanted to thank you, ma'am," Irene said, her voice quieter than usual. Mrs. McAllister's eyebrows furrowed slightly, and Irene could see the hint of surprise in her eyes. "Thank me?" she asked, her voice cool but not unkind. Irene nodded. For what you said the other day, I didn't expect it, and I just wanted to acknowledge that." Mrs. McAllister stood still for a moment, her gaze moving from Irene to the window. "It's not something I usually do," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But I suppose it was overdue." Irene stood there, unsure of what to do or say next. She had always been on the receiving end of Mrs. McAllister's icy demeanor, and to see her speaking so openly, almost vulnerably, was a stark contrast to the woman Irene had known. "I appreciate it," Irene finally said, her voice steady. "I know things aren't perfect, but it's a step." Mrs. McAllister didn't respond immediately, but her posture softened slightly. For the first time, Irene saw a flicker of something resembling respect in her eyes. "I've been harsh with you," Mrs. McAllister said after a pause. "I know that. And I don't like how things have been. But it's not easy for me, either." Irene's heart skipped a beat. This was more than she had expected. Mrs. McAllister was never one to open up, never one to show vulnerability. But now, there she was, speaking with a rawness Irene had never seen. "I know," Irene replied softly, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I've been here for a long time, and I understand what it's like to live in this house, to feel like I'm invisible." Mrs. McAllister's gaze softened further. "I didn't realize how much you were affected by it all. I thought you were just here, doing your job, but I see now that it's more than that." Irene nodded, the words she had been carrying for so long finally being heard. It was a strange feeling, having her experience acknowledged, having her voice matter. "It's been a long road," Irene said quietly, "but I've learned to keep my head down, to not expect more." Mrs. McAllister looked at her for a long moment, her eyes searching Irene's face. "I don't know if I can change everything," she said finally, "but I want to try. I want to make things better, at least for you." The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, neither woman moved. Irene didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure if Mrs. McAllister's words were genuine, or if it was just another passing moment of kindness that would eventually fade. But in that moment, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe things weren't perfect, and maybe the power dynamics in the house wouldn't change overnight. But this was progress, and for the first time, Irene felt like she had a real place in this home. It wasn't just a house where she worked anymore. It was a place where she could be seen. As the morning wore on and Irene continued her tasks, a small part of her began to believe that things could be different. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she was ready for whatever came next. All she knew was that she wasn't invisible anymore. She had been seen, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Irene stood in front of the mirror in the small staff bathroom, adjusting her uniform, her hands steady but her mind in turmoil. The conversation she had with Mrs. McAllister a few days ago had stayed with her. It had been a moment of unexpected honesty, one she hadn't thought possible from someone who had treated her with such cold detachment for years. But now, as she faced the reality of her day-to-day existence in the house, she wondered if this fragile change would last. Mrs. McAllister's softened demeanor had been a small victory, but Irene knew better than to assume it meant a complete shift in how she was treated. She had been here too long to expect miracles. Still, something inside her had shifted. She walked with more purpose now, her head held higher, and although she still kept to her work, she no longer felt as invisible. But the true test would come, she knew. It wasn't until a week later that the true weight of the situation became clear. Irene was working in the kitchen, preparing a meal for the family, when she overheard the sound of raised voices coming from the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat as she instinctively moved toward the source of the commotion, her steps light but quick. She stopped just outside the living room and peered through the crack in the door. Mrs. McAllister and her husband were standing in the center of the room, both clearly upset. The argument was heated, their voices sharp and filled with tension. Irene couldn't make out all the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was wrong. "I've had enough of this, Thomas." Mrs. McAllister's voice rose, laced with frustration. "You're doing it again. You're making excuses for her." Irene's breath caught in her chest. She could only assume they were talking about her. She didn't know what to do. Should she step back and pretend she hadn't heard, or should she find out what this was about? Before she could decide, Mr. McAllister's voice broke through. "It's not about excuses, Laura. It's about doing what's right." Irene felt her chest tighten. She didn't know if they were talking about her directly, but the way Mr. McAllister spoke made her feel like she was at the center of their conflict. "She deserves better than this," he continued, his voice firm. "You've been harsh with her. I see it, and I can't just ignore it anymore." Irene's heart began to race. She had never heard him speak like that, not about her. It was as if something had finally shifted inside him, as if he was seeing her not just as a servant but as a person who deserved dignity and respect. "Mrs. McAllister responded with a scoff. "You're being too soft. She's here to work, not to be treated like she's part of the family." The words cut through Irene like a knife. She stood frozen in place, her body tense with the sting of rejection. It was the same attitude she had always faced, never truly a part of their world, never truly welcome. But then, she heard Mr. McAllister's next words. "I don't care. She is part of this house, and it's time you recognize that." There was a long pause, and then Mrs. McAllister spoke again, her voice softer but still tinged with frustration. "Fine, but I won't pretend everything is fine. I'm not going to let this go." Irene's heart was pounding in her chest. She had never imagined hearing something like this. It was one thing for Mr. McAllister to apologize, but it was entirely different for him to stand up to his wife like this. It wasn't just about the work she did for them anymore. It was about her as a person, about her being seen. The conversation died down after that, but Irene couldn't shake the words. She had never expected anyone, let alone Mr. McAllister, to stand up for her in such a way. It was a moment of recognition that felt like a long time coming. For years, she had been treated as less than, just a face in the background, doing her job and staying out of sight. But now, it seemed like things were changing. Later that day, when Irene was cleaning the family's living room, Mrs. McAllister entered, her expression tight but unreadable. Irene tensed, unsure of what to expect. But instead of the usual dismissive attitude, Mrs. McAllister spoke in a more measured tone. "I heard what Thomas said," she said quietly, her eyes avoiding Irene's gaze. "I don't like being called out. But maybe he's right. You deserve more than what I've given you." Irene could hardly believe her ears. Mrs. McAllister had always been so controlled, so certain in her superiority. But here she was, acknowledging Irene's worth. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. Irene nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you, ma'am," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Mrs. McAllister gave a small nod but didn't say anything else before she left the room. Irene stood there, still processing the conversation. She didn't know what this change meant, but for the first time, she felt like things were actually shifting in her favor. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't over, but it was progress. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different now. Irene woke up the next morning feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Uncertainty mixed with a strange, fragile sense of hope. The house felt quieter today, as if the events of the past week had rippled through the walls, leaving an air of quiet anticipation behind. She had never expected the tension between her and Mrs. McAllister to be resolved so quickly. After their last conversation, there was no longer the same sharpness in her employer's demeanor. It was subtle, but Irene could sense it, a shift in the atmosphere. Mrs. McAllister no longer seemed to dismiss her with the same disdain, though there was still a cold distance between them. It was as if they were both navigating the awkwardness of something unspoken. Irene didn't know what to make of it. She had spent years accepting the way things were, trying to stay invisible, trying to avoid conflict. But now she had to figure out where she stood in this fragile new dynamic. Was this real progress, or just a temporary truce that would break at the first sign of resistance? As she walked through the house, Irene couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change again. Something big. The soft click of heels in the hallway startled her. She turned to see Mrs. McAllister walking toward her, her face composed but serious. Irene braced herself, not sure what to expect this time. Mrs. McAllister stopped in front of her, her gaze focused and unwavering. "Irene," she began, her voice neutral, but there was something in her tone that made Irene's pulse quicken. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened." Irene's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped the conversation would have been left behind, that things would settle into a new routine, but clearly, that wasn't the case. "Yes, ma'am," Irene replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Mrs. McAllister looked at her for a long moment, her eyes searching, as if she were measuring the weight of her words. "I don't want you to think that everything is fine now," she said, her tone firmer. "But I've been thinking about how things have been, about how I've treated you." Irene's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard Mrs. McAllister speak like this before, with such quiet sincerity. For years, she had been nothing but a tool to be used, not someone worth considering. To hear her employer speak this way felt surreal. "You've been here a long time," Mrs. McAllister continued, her voice lowering, almost apologetic. "I've taken you for granted. I've expected things from you without ever really thinking about what you need or how you feel." Irene could feel the tension in her shoulders ease slightly, though the uncertainty still lingered. She wasn't sure if she believed Mrs. McAllister's words or if they were just the result of a moment of guilt, but part of her wanted to believe them. "I'm sorry," Mrs. McAllister added, almost as if the words were difficult for her to say. "I'm sorry for how I've treated you." Irene didn't know how to respond. The apology wasn't something she had ever expected. She had learned long ago that people like Mrs. McAllister didn't apologize, they just expected others to accept their authority, their coldness, their demands. But this was different. "Thank you," Irene said quietly, her voice shaky. Mrs. McAllister gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes briefly meeting Irene's. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. Irene could see the change in Mrs. McAllister's expression. The guardedness that had always been there was still present, but it was less sharp now, less dismissive. She didn't know if this would last. She didn't know if this was just a moment of weakness on Mrs. McAllister's part, or if it was the beginning of something real. But for the first time, Irene felt like she wasn't just a servant, a nameless figure in the background. She was a person, and she had been acknowledged. "I'll do better," Mrs. McAllister said, her voice firm once more. "I'll try to treat you with more respect, and I expect you to hold me to that." Irene nodded, though a part of her still felt uncertain. It was hard to trust that things would change, but in this moment, she allowed herself to hope. As Mrs. McAllister turned to leave, she stopped at the door and glanced back. "I'm glad we talked," she said softly, before walking away. Irene stood in the quiet room, her mind reeling. She wasn't sure what this meant, what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the future was hers to shape. She had always thought she would be stuck in the same role, always serving without ever being seen. But now, something had changed. Maybe things wouldn't be perfect, but for the first time, Irene had hope that things could be different. She wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but for the first time, she was ready to face them. Irene could hear the soft sound of the wind against the window as she stood in the hallway, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the silver tray she was carrying. The house was quieter today, almost eerily so. There was a weight in the air, something that made Irene uneasy. She had been walking on eggshells for days now, ever since the last conversation with Mrs. McAllister. Things had seemed to shift, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still an undercurrent of tension, something not quite resolved. As she moved toward the study, she could feel it again, the unease creeping into her chest, that feeling of not knowing where she stood. She had been here long enough to understand that change in this house was slow, almost imperceptible, and often fleeting. But when she entered the study, she was not prepared for what she found. Mr. McAllister was standing near the large oak desk, a stack of papers in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his expression somber, but not angry. It wasn't a look she had seen often from him. "Irene," he said, his voice steady but filled with something else, something she couldn't quite place. "Come in, please." She set the tray down on the small table beside the door, then stepped into the room. She didn't speak, not knowing if she was welcome or if this was another moment of tension to navigate. "I wanted to apologize," Mr. McAllister continued, his voice softer than usual. Irene blinked, surprised by the words. She had expected a reprimand, perhaps a reminder of her place in the household, but not this. "You've been here a long time," he said, his tone firm yet regretful, "and I've realized that I haven't treated you the way you deserve." Irene's breath caught in her throat. This was more than she had expected. For years, she had been treated as nothing more than a servant, a fixture in the house who existed to do her job without ever being seen as anything more. But here he was, standing in front of her, acknowledging her humanity in a way she hadn't thought possible. "I'm sorry for how I've treated you," he said, his eyes not leaving hers. "I'm sorry for not seeing you, for taking you for granted." Irene stood frozen, her emotions a whirlwind inside her. She had always known that she wasn't seen by the family. She had accepted it, even embraced it, because it made her job easier. But now, hearing Mr. McAllister's words, hearing him apologize, was like opening a door to something she had buried deep inside. "You've done your job well," he continued, his voice steady now, but there was a hint of remorse in his words. "I should have recognized that a long time ago. I should have treated you with more respect." Irene didn't know what to say. She had spent so many years in this house, doing her work without expecting anything more than a paycheck. She had never imagined that one day, someone would stand before her and offer an apology, offer recognition. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She had no other words. She didn't know how to express the gratitude, the relief, the confusion she felt all at once. Mr. McAllister nodded, his eyes searching hers. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened," he said, his tone firm again, "but I want you to know that things are going to be different. I'm going to make sure of it." Irene felt a lump in her throat. It was hard to believe. She had heard these kinds of words before, from people who had good intentions but were unable to change their behavior. But something in Mr. McAllister's voice, something in the sincerity of his apology, made her believe that this time it might be different. "I appreciate that, sir," Irene said, her voice steadier now. "I do." The silence between them hung in the air for a moment, thick with the weight of what had been said. Irene could feel the shift, the quiet tension that had always defined her relationship with the family beginning to dissolve. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like the future was in her hands. Mr. McAllister gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes holding hers. I know I can't change the past, he said quietly, but I will make sure that you're treated the way you deserve to be treated from now on. Irene stood there, not sure what to say next. She had never been in a position like this before, where she had been recognized, seen, and valued for more than just her work. For the first time, she felt like she had a voice in this house, and that voice was being heard. Thank you, she said again, the words heavy with the weight of everything she had been holding back for so long. Mr. McAllister gave her one last look, then turned back to the desk, his focus returning to the papers in front of him. But Irene knew that this moment would not be forgotten. She walked out of the study, her heart light, her mind racing with the possibilities of what this change might mean. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't everything, but it was a start she had never thought she would get. And for the first time in years, Irene allowed herself to feel hope. Irene stood in the kitchen, the aroma of fresh coffee filling the air, her hands steady as she set the table for the family. It had been weeks since the conversation with Mr. McAllister, and yet, everything felt different now. The weight that had once pressed down on her seemed to have lifted, even if just a little. She had always been so used to the silence of this house, the unspoken rules that kept her in the background, always working, always invisible. But now, as she moved through the halls, doing her work with a quiet sense of purpose, she could feel the subtle shifts in the air. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Mrs. McAllister had been more reserved lately, but there were no more cold looks or harsh words. Irene could sense that her employer was trying, in her own way, to make things right. And it wasn't just her. Even the children seemed to treat her with more warmth, no longer simply taking her presence for granted. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was there, and it was enough. As Irene placed the last of the silverware on the dining table, she glanced toward the hallway, where she heard footsteps approaching. Mr. McAllister appeared in the doorway, his usual composed expression softened by something more genuine. Irene's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what this moment would bring, but she was learning not to expect the worst. Irene, Mr. McAllister said, his voice calm but with an edge of warmth she hadn't heard before. I wanted to speak with you for a moment. Irene straightened, uncertain, but nodded. Of course, sir. He stepped into the room, his gaze meeting hers. I know we've had our differences, he began, his voice steady, yet carrying a sincerity that she had only begun to notice recently. But I wanted to thank you for your patience and your hard work. You've been here for so long, and I've never taken the time to truly acknowledge what you do for this family. Irene felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had ever expected from him. Thank you, sir, she said quietly, her voice thick with the emotion that she hadn't realized she had been holding back for so long. Mr. McAllister continued, his words thoughtful. I've been thinking about everything that's happened recently, the way I've treated you, and the way this house has been run. I know I've been distant, but I don't want you to feel like you don't matter. Irene nodded, unsure of how to respond. She had spent so many years accepting her place in the background, doing her job without expecting recognition. The idea that she was being seen, truly seen, felt almost too much to grasp. I'm not asking you to forget what's happened, he said, his voice growing more earnest. But I want you to know that things are going to be different. I'll make sure of it. You deserve to be treated with respect, and I won't let that go unrecognized again. Irene's heart swelled with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Hope. It was a fragile feeling, one she had long abandoned, but now it had returned, a small flicker that grew with every word he spoke. I appreciate that, sir, she said softly, her voice steady despite the wave of emotion inside her. Mr. McAllister gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. I just wanted you to know that you're valued here, and I hope we can move forward from this with a better understanding. Irene stood there, the weight of his words settling over her. For the first time, she felt like the future could be different. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be perfect, but it was a start. As Mr. McAllister turned to leave, Irene felt a deep sense of quiet resolution. She didn't know what the next day would bring, or the next week, but she knew she wouldn't be the same person. She wouldn't accept being invisible anymore. She had fought for her place here, and now, for the first time, she was being seen. As she finished setting the table, Her hands a little less shaky than before, Irene allowed herself a small smile. She had been given something she had never thought possible, a voice. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to use it. Discover a powerful journey of resilience and recognition in these captivating Black stories. Follow the emotional journey of a maid who has always been invisible in a wealthy household, until one day, things begin to change. In these Black stories, the maid is finally seen, treated with respect, and given a voice she never thought she would have. As she faces her employer's harsh words and unexpected apologies, she discovers what it truly means to stand up for herself. These Black stories aren't just about a maid and her employer. They reflect the struggles, strength, and emotional growth that come with being recognized for who you truly are. As Irene, the maid, navigates her path, she learns to never accept being invisible again. The transformation she undergoes is a testament to the power of acknowledgment and change. In this series of Black stories, watch as Irene rises above years of mistreatment to find her place in the world and demand respect. These Black stories are a reminder that no one should ever be overlooked, and that everyone has the right to be seen and heard.